Steve, I want to start by asking you about the scope and impact of these Trump tariffs, and if there's any way to predict whether the worst is over or we're just at the precipice of how bad this can get.
Well, the scope is pretty extensive. We just ran some new numbers at CNBC just to see what the actual tally was. 8.7 trillion wiped off of market cap of stocks since Inauguration Day, 10 trillion since the closing high of February 19th, and most important, 6 trillion in just the past 2 days as the market got a tariff plan that it didn't like to begin with, which is why it was off already. But then it got one that's much worse than it expected. The stock market, Christine, is just not buying the golden age promise of President Trump. In fact, the stock market looks to be selling the golden age promise of Donald Trump. The reasons, well, it creates a real risk of recession right now, raising costs, blowing up the global trading system. And the other thing, you heard Diane Swonk at the beginning of this segment talk about uncertainty. It's a kind of a clinical way of scaring the heck out of businesses and consumers and our trading partners. You don't know if these tariffs are the last tariffs you're going to see, if maybe they go off tomorrow, they go up tomorrow. No one quite knows. These are profound changes in the global trading system and based on, by the way, a completely made up tariff formula. And so as to whether or not they go on, well, some of it's up to President Trump if he could provide some stability as to his tariff proclamations that come down the pike. But troublingly, I guess I'd say, if the market needs to price for a real recession, the market may have more pricing to do.
Well, and Steve, you've been saying part of this inexplicably is it's self-inflicted. You described it as Trump seeing the iceberg and essentially steering the Titanic directly towards it. We kind of know how that storyline ended. But in any sense, you know, what you were just talking about, uncertainty, trust in the markets, even if the White House were to reverse some of these tariffs, can you divine any way that there would be a logical conclusion to this? And is there any logic to how they did these tariffs in the first place?
Well, you know, I was thinking about the range of possibilities between addressing what the president is trying to address, which is to try to bring back some of the manufacturing capabilities and industries of the United States. Between doing nothing and doing what he's done, you could imagine a whole range of possibilities that would have helped and addressed this issue without creating $10 trillion worth of losses. It's very hard to imagine anything that could end up being successful from these programs that would make up for what's happened so far. That's the difficult thing. There are all kinds of ideas about what needs to be done to the U.S. manufacturing sector, what should be done. I mean, one example is the manufacturing that exists in the United States is by definition high value added. Why? Because we do those things for which the labor component is very little, and we buy the things for which the labor component is very much. So what are you doing by raising input costs? You're essentially, I mean, it's like cutting your own Achilles heel. You're saying we're going to raise those costs and take away what advantages U.S. manufacturing has. So it appears to most people as if the president has picked the worst possible choices for a goal that, to some extent, is supported, but there were many other ways perhaps to get this done.
Yeah, Courtney, I want to turn to you because you wrote about how, in your words, this is the end of the world's economic order as we know it. Now, a Trump supporter would say that's a good thing. We need to shake that up. But what does the end of that economic order actually mean for the U.S., for the U.S. consumer, and what are the implications here?
I think the answer is similar to what Steve was just saying, which is I don't think anyone would fight against the goal of trying to rebuild the U.S. manufacturing base in the U.S. The problem, however, is that the U.S. manufacturing base and the global economy are very much interlinked. Even if you make goods here in the U.S. in a facility, maybe there's a part in a machine that you rely on to run your factory that comes from Germany or elsewhere in the EU. I mean, the U.S. and the global trading system are so interlinked, and it is impossible to try to de-link them overnight. I talked to one small manufacturer in South Florida, very supportive of this goal of bringing domestic manufacturing back to the U.S. But very simply, his question was, can we have a little time? Can we not destroy everything that my business was built on top of overnight? Can we have some guidance from the federal government about how to do this in a little bit more of an orderly way? His point to me was, let's say I move all my factory workers from Mexico and Canada, which just a few years ago, I was told nearshoring is a good thing. So if I move all my factories back to the U.S. and in a month, 2 months, 3 months, President Trump decides the trade war is over, his business would get crushed. He would make huge changes on policy that is wobbly at best.
Yeah, the uncertainty does seem to put a larger burden, especially on small business owners who may have a specialty and may sell to one particular market because they can't afford to just keep moving and playing economic whack-a-mole according to the policy. Peter, I also want to ask you about the messaging from the White House, because there seems to be a bit of a mixed message coming from down the street here, with Trump saying there's room to negotiate, but others in his orbit and his administration saying that's not part of the plan, that's not what's motivating this. Does anybody know what actually is motivating this? Are there negotiations underway? And is the White House willing to play ball on that issue?
Well, that's exactly the problem here, because in fact, people don't know what the end goal is here, right? Is this a means to an end? Or is this the end itself, right? Is this intended to simply leverage the power of the American economy to achieve certain outcomes that would be beneficial if the other trading partners were to make concessions that we want to make? Or is, in fact, this a new permanent, sustained order in which we keep these barriers up for a long period of time in order to change our economic model here at home? And you hear both things coming from this administration. You're absolutely right. At one point on the air, Peter Navarro was saying, this is not a negotiation. This is not a tactic. This is not a way of getting people to make concessions. And then later that day, the president himself said, yeah, this is great. People come to me and they're ready to negotiate, and this is what I like. So that's what, in fact, exacerbates this volatility and the uncertainty, because as we were just talking about, if you don't know whether this is in fact the end game in itself or just a temporary, payment or a temporary cost while we extract benefits, you make different plans depending on which one of those things it really was.
And Steve, is there a floor under this thing? Do we have any idea how far the markets might fall and how long? If this policy were to be reversed tomorrow or next week, how long it would even take Wall Street to recover and get back to those highs? Months, years, TBD?
It's very difficult to know. There are people out there who we debate all day long on CNBC. If you'd like to become part of that discussion, should you buy the dip here? Certainly, stocks that were attractive, 10% or higher, are cheaper now, and they could be more attractive. A couple problems with that. First is the idea of is there going to be a recession? If there is going to be a recession, most economists and strategists say stocks would have further to fall, because typically in a recession, corporate earnings would decline by 20 to 25%. And the outlook for corporate earnings right now does not necessarily reflect such a steep drop. The other issue is the lack of clarity, which we've talked about. Think about this idea that as a businessman or business executive, you don't know what your costs are going to go up. You don't know the extent to which you have to raise your costs. Will your customer be able to buy it? You might be another business servicing a business affected by the tariffs. You don't know what's going to happen to that business. What's happened now with the stock market is maybe the equivalent of standing on the train tracks and seeing a train come at you. You can stand on the train tracks and you can try to gauge the speed of that train and have a nice discussion with yourself of if that train is going to hit you. Or you can do what a lot of investors have done the last couple of days, which is to get the heck off the tracks.
It's like a new, even less fun trolley problem. Courtney, in another one of your articles, you cite April 9th as the date when the so-called reciprocal tariffs are implemented. What happens then, and what products might be most effective? Some European ministers have even said they're going to specifically target products they think are made in red states that, in their view, have supported Trump in these policies.
Right. It's kind of the playbook from Trump 1.0, but to the extreme. As far as the way that global allies want to hit back at the U.S. China, for instance, was very much interested in hitting where they thought would hurt President Trump most, and that is in farm country. You may remember the administration having to essentially give farmers not a bailout, but support, because there was such pain felt on the ground there with China, buying less soybeans, for instance. So I think there is this real political goal to not only try to hurt the U.S. economy, but try to hurt the U.S. economy where it will be most politically salient. I think that is really the case in Canada, of all places. There is kind of a grassroots campaign to boycott U.S. goods, things like bourbon and other liquor. You see photos online of Canadian liquor shelves just completely wiped out from any American products. So I think these countries are thinking about how to hit back at President Trump in a way that maybe he'll feel politically, and maybe that would force him to back off. But we haven't really seen any willingness on the part of the president to back off. Maybe there was a quick instance yesterday when he posted on Truth Social. Perhaps there is some deal to be made with Vietnam, but other than that, it seems like the stock market in free fall. All of these terrifying economic anecdotes you're hearing from businesses, large and small, has not been enough to make the president back off yet.